Well, good morning, brothers and sisters in Christ. Another discussion rooted in Genesis. This time, what about carbon-14 dating? Now, I opted not to include carbon-14 dating in our discussion about other radiometric dating techniques for a couple of different reasons. Number one, the half-life is so short, so much different than many of those other dates that have or other techniques rather, that have extremely long half-lives. But then equally, radiocarbon is being continually formed in the atmosphere. It's just a different discussion that's worthy of a little more attention. And so today we take up what about carbon-14 dating. Now, in our time in Genesis, you've probably come to recognize that really, I believe in a young creation. Greater than 6,000 years, less than 10,000 years. If we look at the history contained in the Old Testament, and we looked at this just briefly in our introduction to the book of Genesis, we're already at Abraham just 2,000 years after the creation. So there's no way to get history that's beyond about 10,000 years old. Equally, if we approach history from the New Testament, we're going to find a creation that, again, is greater than 6,000 years old and less than 10,000. And again, if the argument is, well, Matthew's missing a couple of the kings in his lineage, of course he is, and that's a great discussion, and to walk through the reasons why that may be. But again, what we see, both Old Testament and New Testament, is a creation that's very young. So as we think about the biblical timeline, again, these are rough dates, and they could be off by a little bit, and we get that. We could be missing a couple of people, but they're close enough. We're looking at creation that's a little over 6,000 years at the youngest, no more than 10,000 years at the oldest. This is in stark contrast to the timeline that is taught in our secular schools, our secular colleges and universities, the widely accepted timeline of the universe. Now, I will tell you, the James Webb Space Telescope is blowing this whole model up. I just saw a picture of a galaxy that they believe formed 13.2 to 13.5 billion years ago. Well, that's galaxy formation right at the Big Bang. That completely destroys the model. They thought it took billions of years for galaxies to form. We now see galaxies forming almost at the Big Bang. Equally, in that galaxy, they saw third-generation stars. A galaxy that old should not have third-generation stars. So this model is completely blown up already. It will fall by the wayside, and a new model will take its place that will be just as erroneous as this one. But this is what is taught in the bulk of our schools. So what about carbon-14 dating? Can't radioactive carbon be used to help settle this matter on the age of the creation? Well, it cannot, but it does give us some information, and you having an understanding of the limitations of that information are critical. And so let's take up this discussion. So this first video clip is from Scientific America. I used this video clip in the dinosaur presentation, but I want to advance the discussion. You may not have watched the dinosaur presentation, and so I want to show it again. It is a very simplified, although correct explanation of carbon-14, how it is created, and how we can use carbon-14 to date the age of organic material. We'll walk through this in much greater detail following the video, but this initiates the discussion.
How do we know how old something is? For people, we'd ask to see their birth certificate. For trees, we'd count the rings. But how do we know how old a fossil is? Fossils have their own internal clock. Scientists can read it by looking at the ratio of two different types of carbon atoms. Of course, every living thing is made of carbon. Plants grab carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and use it to form complex organic molecules. Animals get their carbon by eating these plants. But there's more than one form of carbon. Most carbon atoms have 6 protons and 6 neutrons. We call this carbon-12. High up in the atmosphere, sometimes cosmic rays hit nitrogen atoms. This creates carbon with 6 protons and 8 neutrons. We call this carbon-14. Carbon-12 and carbon-14 behave alike, but carbon-14 has one unique and important attribute. It's unstable. So once an animal dies, the carbon-14 in its body will start to go away. Every 5,730 years on average, about half of the carbon-14 atoms will decay into nitrogen. This is its half-life. After one half-life, the animal will have about half the amount of carbon-14 it started with. After another half-life, it will have about a quarter. And after another half-life, it will have about an eighth. By contrast, the amount of carbon-12 it has in its body will stay the same. By measuring the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, we can measure how many thousands of years have passed since the animal died. Carbon dating works for fossils up to about 60,000 years old. For older fossils, scientists use unstable elements that have much longer half-lives. For Scientific American's Instant Egghead, I'm Michael Moyer.
So as you think about this matter of carbon-14 dating, how it works, let's go back to the atmosphere. The most abundant element in our atmosphere is nitrogen-14. Nitrogen-14 has 7 protons, thus the element is nitrogen, and 7 neutrons, thus the atomic weight is 14. Cosmic rays or cosmic particles interact in our upper atmosphere and they form neutrons. Occasionally, rare but it happens, one of these neutrons will bump into, in just the right way, a nitrogen atom. He talked about this all the way over, he simplified it, and it'll bump out a protein and pick up that neutron. So it has 6 protons instead of 7, so it's no longer nitrogen, but now carbon. This is a new element. The loss of the proton creates the new element. It's no longer nitrogen, it's carbon. But it has 8 neutrons, so its atomic weight is still 14. The mass is 14. But it has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. In this configuration, as stated, it is unstable. It is radioactive. And it will decay back into nitrogen over time. On average, as he pointed out, the half-life is 5,730 years. And by the way, that is plus or minus 40 if you're really trying to boil this down. And by the way, that is on average. You can't predict when one particular atom is going to convert back. He said that we could date things back to about 60,000 years. There are some who believe, and I mean some of these who work in this area, that using AMS, you can date back to about 100,000. But the bottom line is, beyond that date, nothing that we're going to be dating in a lab should have any remaining carbon-14. It should have all converted back to nitrogen. Okay, so let's pick back up the story. So this carbon-14, a very small amount in our atmosphere, along with carbon-12 and carbon-13, which are stable forms, mix with oxygen and create CO2, or carbon dioxide. A small amount of the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere contains this radioactive carbon that's going to turn back into nitrogen. So again, as you continue to think about this, this is to look at the isotopes of carbon. Carbon-12, the most predominant, most abundant in the atmosphere. Again, almost 99%. Very stable. There's also carbon-13, just a hair over 1%. Carbon-13 is also very stable. And then there's carbon-14, this unstable variety, this isotope of carbon. Very, very small amount in the atmosphere, 1 part per trillion. And you can see because it is unstable, because it is radioactive, it has an associated half-life. So on average, half of the carbon-14 will decay back into nitrogen every 5,730 years, plus or minus 40 years. So I've sort of labored on this point. I've said all of that to say this. This is how you date things, either living or dead. If they're alive, they'll be at equilibrium, in theory, with the atmosphere, and they'll date exactly in equilibrium, no date. As they die, they fall out of alignment, they fall out of equilibrium. The carbon-14 is now decaying, and comparing that difference between the carbon-12 and the carbon-14 is going to give you that supposed date. Now, although there's a little bit of disagreement, you heard in the video 60,000 years, and you'll see in other places 100,000 years, universally it's agreed that carbon-14 and anything we're going to be dating in a lab would be completely depleted at about 100,000 years. In fact, science has indicated that if the whole Earth were made of carbon-14, I think it would be completely deplete in like 1,000,000 years. So anything we're going to be dating in a lab completely depleted at 100,000 years. So all of the carbon-14, 100,000 years and beyond, in anything we're going to dig up out of the ground will have already converted back to nitrogen, 100,000 years or less. So it's important to note that carbon-14 dating comes with assumptions, important assumptions. These assumptions are very similar in many ways to the radiometric dating assumptions, but are worthy of additional discussion. But again, I don't want you to miss the important point. I've said it at least a couple of times. Carbon-14 can never provide an age over 100,000 years old, much less millions, tens of millions, or hundreds of millions. The fact that you find carbon-14 in something, regardless of anything else, indicates it is not millions of years old. Going back to our story, this small portion of carbon dioxide that's made up of this radioactive carbon is converting back to nitrogen over time. Everything alive is taking in carbon dioxide. Plants are taking it in and creating oxygen. You and I are eating plants. We're eating animals that eat plants. We're all at equilibrium. A small portion of this carbon-14 is decaying constantly in our bodies, in the atmosphere. But since we're taking it in, we're at equilibrium. So with every living thing on the planet, in theory, we're all at equilibrium. We have the same level of C12 in our body, and we have the same level of C14. When we die and we stop taking it in, and that C14 on average is converting every 5,730 years, half of it, to nitrogen, that's when we can calculate the supposed age. Now, sometimes a picture is helpful. So here's a basic picture. Cosmic rays in our upper atmosphere interact and create nitrogen. Create neutrons. Those neutrons collide in some rare cases with nitrogen and 14, and that collision in some rare cases creates carbon-14. Carbon-14 combines with oxygen to create CO2, carbon dioxide, which is used by plants to produce their cells, create oxygen. We eat the plants, we eat animals that eat the plants. Everything here is at equilibrium with the small amount of this radioactive carbon. Each year it's estimated that in the upper atmosphere, about 21 pounds of nitrogen are converted into carbon-14. That is a very small amount when you think about, we're talking about the entire planet. Okay, so some dating assumptions. What are the assumptions that we're making? So let's just kind of talk about them. This is important, and it's probably better for me to introduce this idea through a quick video. So everyone agrees the science is good if the assumptions are not violated. This next video clip discusses those assumptions. Okay, so this clip about dating assumptions for carbon-14 dating was created by Genesis Apologetics. It deals with these assumptions, and it comes from the short video, Does Carbon-14 Dating Go Beyond Biblical History?
Can carbon-14 dating reliably show that certain fossils or artifacts date tens of thousands of years ago, far outside of biblical history that points to a miraculous creation just thousands of years ago? Well, let's start out by saying that the actual process of carbon-14 dating includes sound science and uses high-tech lab equipment that costs millions. So the method itself is not the issue. It's the assumptions that are made when the raw isotope ratio gets converted to calendar years that carbon dating becomes unreliable and inaccurate, especially when dating really old items. Just what are the assumptions that are being made when interpreting carbon-14 test results? Actually, there's quite a few. Let's look quickly at just 8 of them. Forest fires, which pump a huge amount of carbon into the atmosphere. Atomic activity and releases, which even double the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere. Volcanic eruptions that blow carbon even hundreds of miles around the eruption. Industrialization, where factories produce carbon. Solar flares, carbon reservoirs, changes in atmospheric pressures, and variances in the Earth's magnetic field. Just like other types of radiometric dating, translating carbon-14 test results into calendar years requires assuming a uniform decay rate of the isotopes involved. When scientists attempt to stretch the results of carbon dating back many thousands of years, are any of these assumptions being violated? Do we know about all the forest fires and volcanic eruptions that have occurred in the distant past? Atomic activity, solar flares and cycles, the Earth's magnetic field? Certainly not. We run out of clearly documented historical events that validate these assumptions after just a couple thousand years. And scientists already try to account for the violations of these assumptions that we happen to know about. So, if we know that these assumptions have been violated in our known past of just a couple thousand years and have to account for them, how in the world can we say that there are no violations to these assumptions over the previous tens of thousands of years that aren't confirmed in written history?
Yeah, so the obvious point is we cannot. As we think about this, because in the analysis we're comparing the ratio of carbon-14, that's the radioactive carbon that converts back to nitrogen, to carbon-12 to arrive at a date, the assumptions become critical. Number one assumption, carbon-12 levels are consistent over time. We know that is not true. Since the Industrial Revolution, and you can Google this however you like, carbon-12 levels in the atmosphere have been increasing. Now it goes up and down, but overall continuing to increase. So carbon-14 levels in the short history that we know about and document are not consistent. We have no way of knowing about what they were prior to that. Carbon-14 levels have not been consistent over time. Not only nuclear testing in the atmosphere, but we had good evidence that for some reason they weren't consistent prior to that. The decay rate must be consistent over time. In theory it is, but we have no idea as a Christian what processes God used at the global flood. Those processes could have altered the decay rate of all of these elements, including radioactive carbon. And so we can't even blanket say that the decay rate is consistent over time. But here's what we can say. If any of these processes are violated, and for certain 2 of them are, the further the supposed look back in time, the greater the uncertainty of the results, thus likely the greater the error. This next video clip was developed by a nuclear physicist to describe the problems we're talking about with carbon-14 dating as you go back beyond the 20th century. It's important to note he is not a creationist. I have no reason to believe he's a believer. He's simply dealing with these issues of carbon-14 dating. He doesn't have a dog in the fight, really. And so I love using him or people like him because they're just telling the truth about the science.
Now let's look at carbon. The 2 most common isotopes of carbon in our atmosphere are carbon-12 and carbon-13, which are both extremely stable and not radioactive. But every once in a while you come across an isotope of carbon in the atmosphere that isn't stable. This is carbon-14, and it has a half-life just shy of 6,000 years. Carbon-14 is always produced at a constant rate in the atmosphere by cosmic rays from deep space striking nitrogen-14 isotopes. These cosmic rays induce an inverse beta decay, or a beta plus decay, that converts one of the protons in a nitrogen-14 atom into a neutron, turning the atom into carbon-14. But remember, the chemistry of carbon-14 is exactly like carbon-12. So this carbon-14 atom bonds to 2 oxygen atoms to make CO2. Down on the ground, a respiring plant breathes in this CO2 molecule and uses the carbon to build its tissues and grow. And so at any moment in time, a living plant has the same ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 as in the atmosphere. Similarly, any animal that eats plants also has this ratio. But once the plant dies, or the animal dies, no new carbon is entering their system. The total number of carbon-14 atoms in their bodies is frozen at the time of their deaths. And slowly over time, this carbon-14 decays back into nitrogen-14 at a predictable rate. The moment that tree branch was turned into an axe handle, the clock started ticking, and we only need to measure the ratios of carbon-14 to carbon-12 to read the clock. So why doesn't this work anymore for anything that died in the 20th century and beyond? At the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union, together with a few other nations, tested over 500 nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. Among other things, these tests scattered a lot of carbon-14 in the atmosphere, far in excess of what cosmic rays were producing. So much so that radiocarbon dating a person that died in the 1960s today would give you a negative age for their remains, as though their body had traveled backward in time from the future. But the era of nuclear testing in the atmosphere is long over, and most of that extra carbon-14 has settled out, returning to the numbers you get from cosmic rays. So what's the problem with carbon dating now? Well, remember that the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in a plant is almost exactly what you find in the atmosphere. And one way to mess up this ratio is to add a lot of extra carbon-14 in the form of nuclear tests. But the other way is just to add a lot of carbon-12, and that's exactly what we're doing right now.
And as he goes to that second point, that's exactly what we're doing right now. That is exactly what we've been doing. So as you consider that since the Industrial Revolution, we have been dumping larger and larger amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere through burning of fossil fuels, as you consider that we have no idea what the CO2 levels were prior to the Industrial Revolution, as you consider further that we have no idea what the CO2 levels were in ancient history and even before the flood, comparing these two results is a completely erroneous idea if we don't know, if they're not consistent over time, or we don't know what they were at the time. But it's even worse than that. So we talked about the dumping, the testing of atomic explosions in the atmosphere created a lot of carbon-14, and that's been decaying since. But already before that, they were wrestling with the fact that the carbon-14 level was not at equilibrium, although the science said it should have been. Dr. Willard Libby is the founder of carbon-14 dating, and here's, according to Richard Milton, here's what he said, quote, he, that's referring to Willard Libby, found a considerable discrepancy in his measurements indicating that apparently radiocarbon was being created in the atmosphere somewhere around 25% faster than it was becoming extinct. Now, this should not be. What's he going to do with that? According to Richard Milton, his word did. Since this result was inexplicable by any conventional scientific means, Libby put the discrepancy down to experimental error. So even early on, we have evidence. We know the carbon-12 values have not been in equilibrium. We're pumping more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But we had equal good evidence that the C14 levels were not at equilibrium, even when this science was first founded. This is Taylor. In 1985, he reports radiocarbon is forming 28 to 37% faster than it's decaying. That's in line with what Libby found, although he couldn't explain it because it didn't make any sense. So we have no idea about the production of carbon-14 in the recent ancient history, much less prior to Noah's flood, especially if there was any type of water, ice, or water vapor canopy. Imagine if there was any type of canopy, even a thin canopy, even a thin water vapor canopy, in addition to the current layers of our atmosphere, that changes everything. That completely changes the production of carbon-14. That makes dating absolutely impossible. That means the production of carbon-14 prior to the flood was very low, if anything. So the further we look back in time, the less understanding we have of both the carbon-12 and the carbon-14 levels. It was in Noah's flood that buried the tons upon tons of carbon materials that we're now burning. Without that knowledge, the knowledge of C12 and C14 in the past, because we compare these values, there's no way to accurately date things the further we go back in history. So this works great if we're dating things that are very, very, very young. And I should say this works great in theory, because I have some more things to say here, but it works great in theory if we're dating things very, very, very young. But even the theory falls apart because we have clear evidence that both the C12 and C14 values were much different in the past. I want to remind us of something as you think about my first point here, and that's about the potential for a water ice or water vapor canopy, even a thin canopy. If you remember in Genesis 1, we read this, beginning in verse 6. And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the water. So let's set the stage. We were looking at a water-covered globe at this point. God had created the earth. He had created matter. He had created energy. And he had created light, although he had not created the light givers. This is the start of day 2. And God is going to create an expanse that is, quote, in the midst of waters. Well, we understand the water that's on the bottom, that's the earth. We understand in a moment, we're going to read this, the expanse is heaven, but what's the water that appears to be above this? He goes on to say, Moses does, and let it separate waters from water. So this expanse called heaven is going to separate waters below from waters above. That's where we get the idea, excuse me, of a thin water vapor, or ice canopy in this separation of waters and waters. Picking up in verse 7, and God made the expanse, and he separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse, and it was so. So we have waters above this expanse. Verse 8, and God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second yom, or the second day. So that forces the question, did the pre-flood world look something like this? Was there another layer to our atmosphere, possibly the upper area of our mesosphere, that was a thin ice canopy? Or was it in some other area of our atmosphere being a thin water or water vapor canopy? Let's be honest, we don't know. But as we read Genesis 1, that is the hint we get. And this is going to come back around as we look at the global flood. But continuing on with problems about carbon-14 dating, let's now talk about the process. So this next video clip deals with issues of dating things using carbon-14 when we know the dates of those things and send them out to different labs. So these are relatively recent things that we know the date of, and we're going to send these to different labs. What happens? Again, this video clip was put together by Genesis Apologetics. And we're really dealing with, okay, we know the date of these things, and we send them out to be dated.
Fortunately, there is a way to put carbon-14 dating to the validation test, where we can see how accurately it can date items of known ages. This is exactly what the British Science and Engineering Research Council did when they conducted an international blind study on carbon-14 dating by sending out artifacts of known ages to 38 of the world's leading carbon-14 testing laboratories. The results? Only 7 of the 38 laboratories produced dates that were even close to the known dates of the artifacts. That's only 18% of the laboratories in this international study. The rest, 82% of the laboratories, produced dates that were across the board, being off by even thousands of years. Given the short half-life of carbon-14, only 5,730 years, organic materials that are supposedly older than 100,000 years, which is about 18 half-lives, should contain absolutely no detectable carbon-14. However, coal, diamonds, and even dinosaur bones contain plenty of carbon-14. These coal samples carbon date to be between 40 and 60,000 years, but they are sandwiched between geological layers that are supposedly 34 to 318 million years old. So, which age are we supposed to believe? Maybe they are all wrong. In fact, these coal carbon-14 results show that the plants that eventually became coal were uprooted at about the same time, demonstrating that the tectonic upheaval occurred during Noah's flood when the fountains of the Great Deep ruptured according to Genesis 7:11. Carbon-14 is also found in diamonds, which supposedly take millions and millions of years to form. Diamond is the hardest naturally occurring substance known, so it should be very resistant to contamination, yet they are repeatedly found with measurable levels of carbon-14 in them. Carbon-14 is even repeatedly found in dinosaur bones, indicating that these animals were created on the 6th day of creation, just thousands of years ago. Between 1984 and 1998 alone, the scientific literature reported carbon-14 in 70 samples that came from fossils, coal, oil, natural gas, and marble, representing the fossil-bearing portion of the geologic record, supposedly spanning more than 500 million years, all containing radiocarbon that shouldn't be there if the Earth is really billions of years old. Does carbon-14 dating really provide a dependable way to build a worldview about the history of the Earth? Trusting in carbon-14 dating, like any form of radiometric dating, requires faith. All forms of radiometric dating depend on assumptions. Assumptions about the starting levels of the parent and daughter elements, the decay rate, and the consistency of the environment where the item was located. These assumptions can never be proven because we can't go back in time to validate them.
And that's the key point. We don't know what the history looked like. We can't validate them. We can't say this was actually the level, so we're just for it. So getting back to the point, the problems are not in the science. In a sterile lab, this works correctly. But in the real world, that is not what we observe on things that we know are not very old and we send out to be dated. Again, 18% of the labs, only 18%, return reasonably accurate results of things where we knew the age. That's the lab itself. That's not even dealing with the fact that we know that the assumptions, in particular that the carbon-12 and carbon-14 levels have been steady, are both violated. We have no way to determine what those levels actually were in the recent past, especially. We can't adjust them. But sometimes, an example of how this plays out in the field is much more revealing than anything I can do. And so let's do a quick example of how this plays out in the field. The example is Mungo Lady, that's Mungo Lady right there, and Mungo Man. In 1969, human remains were found at Lake Mungo. That's a dry lake bed in southeastern Australia. These were crushed and burnt skeletal fragments of Aborigines. This particular one, Mungo Lady, was believed to be a female. What made the find significant was the assigned date. Carbon-14 dating on the bone yielded an age of 19,000 years old. And on the collagen gave a date of 24,700 years old. Now this is super exciting. Then carbon-14 dating on nearby charcoal produced an age of 26,500 years old. So this meant that the skeletal remains, in fact, of the two dates that were younger, because this was buried slightly lower than the charcoal, had to be that age or older. So automatically, Mungo Lady was dated at 26,500 years old. So we didn't take either dates that came from Mungo Lady, carbon-14 dates, but we took the date that came from charcoal that was near Mungo Lady, but in the same stratigraphy, in the same layer. And so not surprisingly, the older charcoal age was considered the most reliable, and this launched Mungo Woman to national and indeed international fame. Now, if you're wondering why Mungo Lady would be launched to international fame, at 26,000 years old, Mungo Lady or Mungo Woman was nearly twice as old as the previous oldest date for Aboriginal settlements in Australia. So we had dates of these settlements, but this blew that date away. Here's an Aborigine who lived well before that, and you ready for this? It looks like she was cremated. So this is not only the oldest Aboriginal settlement, but this is by far the oldest cremation in the world. Forget Australia. This is a famous find. But the plot thickens. In 1974, a skeleton sprinkled with powdered red ochre was found in a grave only 450 meters away. Now we say only 450 meters, but whatever. This one was well preserved, and it was similar to skeletons of modern Aborigines. Okay, so this one wasn't as damaged as Mungo Lady. This was the third one they had found, and so this was Lake Mungo 3, they named this skeleton. And because it was in the same sand bed, the same stratigraphic horizon, the same stratigraphy, he was assigned the same age as Mungo Woman or Mungo Lady. Thus, Mungo Man or Lake Mungo 3 became famous too because he was one of the world's earliest ritual burials. So they believe he was a ritual burial. And so now they have a cremated woman, a ritual buried man, all at 26,000 years old. This is absolutely incredible. Mungo Man and Mungo Lady are just breaking history all over the place. But the story even gets better. Even more exciting, as I typed here, when a different dating method, in this case thermoluminescence, was used. In 1998, Ballard reported that sand from the Mungo 3 site gave an age of 42,000 years old, being older than all of these carbon-14 dates. Mungo Man, and by necessity Mungo Lady, acquire a new stature of the world on the world's evolutionary scene. These earlier reliable carbon-14 ages are abandoned in favor of this new, much more exciting thermoluminescent one. But then it gets even better. In 1999, Thorne, not to be outdone, and other scientists published a new comprehensive study on the age of Mungo Man. They used different samples of bone, different samples of sand, different dating methods. They used electron spin resonance, ESR, optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, thorium, uranium, protactinium, uranium, and the results from all these different methods agreed closely. Their conclusion, Mungo Man was 62,000 years old. So how old was Mungo Man? Was Mungo Man 19,000 years old? Was Mungo Man 24,700 years old? Was Mungo Man 26,500 years old? Was Mungo Man 42,000 years old? Was Mungo Man 62,000 years old? I have a better question. Is this scientific? Is this how science works? By the way, the article I just read today, they've settled that Mungo Man, or at least this particular author had settled he's 42,000 years old. I can assure you he's not 42,000 years old. He's less than 10,000 years old. But this just shows how this science is working. And what's amazing is how reliant they are on all these different dates, regardless of how all over the map they are. So continuing this discussion about carbon-14 dating, this next video clip is from the DVD Evolution's Achilles Heels. You're going to hear from Dr. Jim Mason and Dr. Jonathan Sephardi and others on carbon-14 dating.
People think carbon dating can be used to date things that are millions or even billions of years old. However, because of its half-life, carbon dating can only be used theoretically to date things that are at most a few tens of thousands of years old. Because after that length of time, so much of the carbon-14 is decayed that there's not enough of it left to be detected, even with today's modern instruments.
If the whole Earth was pure carbon-14, it could only last about 1 million years before it's all gone and we couldn't detect it. And yet, we repeatedly find carbon-14 in objects which are claimed to be millions and even billions of years old, including diamonds. But the fact that we're finding carbon-14 shows they can't be millions or billions of years old. So carbon-14 is in fact a very strong ally of the biblical timescale and strong evidence against the millions of years of evolution.
What dating of fossils has shown us over time is that there is carbon-14 in the fossil material. This is true whether or not they are fossils of mosasaurs, or fossils of seashells, or fossils of petrified wood, or any of the varieties of fossil fuels that we have, especially coal and oil and natural gas. Samples of these have been analyzed since the 1970s and consistently show us ages that there shouldn't be if they were in fact millions of years old. Coal is a particularly interesting case for carbon-14. Coal is the remains of plants that have been compressed, and so they were part of the ecosystem and had an active connection to carbon-14. It's found globally, and it's found throughout the geological record. When creation scientists sampled coal seams from different places and analyzed them for the amount of carbon-14, they found that regardless of where they were collected or from what layers of geology they were found, they all registered statistically the same amount of carbon-14. So with the coal seams, rather than providing evidence of gradual deposition and formation of coal over tens or hundreds of millions of years, the identical amounts of carbon-14 in all of the samples that were collected actually shows that they were all buried within the recent past.
Now that point that he just makes at the end is extremely critical to our discussion. As you looked at the stratigraphy there, as you looked at the layers there, one would assume that great passages of time occurred between the laying down of those layers. But yet when we carbon date those coal seams, they all have essentially the same date, indicating that what we see there is deposition or the laying down of layers in short order of time in some type of global cataclysmic event where multiple layers are laid down through the movement of water rapidly. Summarizing that quick video, the dating method does not provide reliable, consistent dates because the assumptions are not valid. We lack information about the past to calibrate those dates. But there's a more important point that we need to make here. The existence of carbon-14 in items that are supposedly millions, tens of millions, or hundreds of millions of years old, diamonds, fossils, oil, coal, natural gas, all scream one thing. They are very strong evidence for a young creation. The existence of carbon-14 in any of those things, because of the supposed age of those things, the carbon-14 would have been long ago depleted. And yet, measurable dates coming back in the tens of thousands of years. Again, that's not taking into account, we're not measuring it accurately. The fact that it's there at any rate screams a young creation. Now, sometimes actual examples tell the best story. Now, I had a ton of these, and I stripped out many just to get a handful of them and get the point across. So there is so much evidence on the internet if you want to run this point. So many examples of where this breaks down in the field. This is here the lower leg of the Fairbanks Creek mammoth had a radiocarbon date of 15,380, while its skin and flesh had a radiocarbon date of 21,300. We write that off as some type of contamination. Living mollusk shells have been carbon dated at 2,300 years old. We've now determined, well, you just can't date mollusk shells. This is a researcher. If a carbon-14 date, and this is an Egyptologist, if a carbon-14 date supports our theories, we put it in the main text. If it does not entirely contradict them, we put it as a footnote. If it's completely out of date, we just drop it. So we pick the date we like, we hide some, and throw the rest out. A freshly killed seal was carbon dated as having died 1,300 years ago. Material from layers where dinosaurs are found in this particular study dated at 34,000 years old. One piece of Dima, this is a baby frozen mammoth, dated 40,000 years. Another part of Dima, the same animal, dated 26,000 years, while the wood immediately around her carcass dated 9 to 10,000 years. So which is it? It's none of those. One part of the Vallis Vic mammoth carbon dated at 29,500 years old, another part at 44,000 years old. Here's a researcher. The troubles of radiocarbon dating are undeniably deep and serious. Despite 35 years of technological refinement and better understanding, the underlying assumptions have been strongly challenged, and warnings are out that radiocarbon dating may soon find itself in a crisis situation. Continuing use of the method depends on a fix-it-as-we-go approach, allowing for contamination here, fractionation there, and calibration whenever possible. It should be no surprise, then, that fully half the dates are rejected. The wonder is, surely, that the remaining half have come to be accepted. No matter how useful it is, though, the radiocarbon method is still not capable of yielding accurate and reliable results. There are gross discrepancies. The chronology is uneven and relative, and the accepted dates are actually selected dates. This whole blessed thing is nothing but 13th century alchemy, and it all depends upon which funny paper you read. That is not me, that is Robert E. Lee. A geologist at Berkeley Geochronology Center, Carl Swisher, uses the most advanced techniques to date human fossils. A couple years ago, he was reevaluating Homo erectus. We talked about Homo erectus in our presentation on man, but he was reevaluating Homo erectus skulls that were found in Java in the 1930s by testing the sediment and things found in the sediment. A hominid species, Homo erectus, is assumed to be an ancestor of Homo sapiens. We've already built the case he is a Homo sapien. Erectus was thought to have vanished some 250,000 years ago. But even though he used two different dating methods, Swisher kept making the same startling find. The bones were 53,000 years old at the most, and possibly no more than 27,000 years old. A stretch of time that puts Homo erectus contemporary with modern humans. Well, of course he's contemporary because he is modern humans. These dating methods do not work the further you go back in the past, and when you really look at what you're getting, it's all pointing to a young creation. And here Homo erectus is pointing to living contemporaneous with Homo sapiens, which indeed he did. This is from the book Bones of Contention. Quote, Baumgartner also sent a diamond to a radiocarbon laboratory for dating. This had never been done before because evolutionists would consider it absurd, sheer lunacy. Diamond formed deep in the Precambrian rocks of the Earth. It would be almost as old as the Earth itself. Hence, to date a diamond by carbon-14 was assumed to be pointless. The report came back. The diamond was about 58,000 years old. By the way, since then we've dated a number of diamonds, creationists have, and every diamond returns a result. Now, that is impossible unless the only possibility is the Earth is not millions of years old. That's the only possibility. Diamonds cannot be contaminated in situ, the hardest substance on the planet, so it's not about contamination. You've got a protected environment where the carbon-14 is going to decay back to nitrogen. In diamonds, there should be no radioactive carbon, and yet we're continuing to find radioactive carbon. Continue on with bones of contention. The big surprise, however, was that no fossil material can be found that had as little as 0.001% of the modern carbon-14 values. Lest you miss the full impact of that statement, it means that carbon-14 has been found in fossils all the way down to the Cambrian period, which were considered by evolutionists to be 600 million years old. The existence of carbon-14 in these fossil layers overthrows everything about the geologic column and everything about the supposed age of the Earth. Continue on with quotes from Bones of Contention. The bottom line of this research is that the case is now extremely compelling that the fossil record was produced just a few thousand years ago by the global flood cataclysm. The evidence reveals that macroevolution as an explanation for the origin of life on Earth can therefore no longer be rationally defended. Now, we built the case in class with lots of different reasons. Just the statistical improbability of one protein cell forming by chance is mathematically impossible. But the bottom line is, as we clearly crush the time available for man to live on this planet, and the fact that carbon-14 is in everything we date that contained carbon when it was alive or when it existed, is strong evidence this is a very young creation. And I would agree with Marvin Lubenow. The evidence reveals that macroevolution as an explanation for the origin of life on Earth is no longer tenable and cannot be rationally defended. And we can argue all that we want to explain why everything we date has carbon-14 in it and write it all off as machine error or as background measurements, but we're kidding ourselves. Look at the evidence. Look at the dates of the fossils. Look at the evidence. Closing observations. So when you consider carbon-14 dating, what we do is we take samples of something we know the age of, and we send it off to labs to have it dated. And often, like a great percentage of the time, let's just use a round number, 80% of the time, dating young things that we know the age of, we get a bad date. Dating living things we know the age of, we get an incorrect date. And it's actually higher than 80% because that was just the study where they sent off things. We date things that are alive and get wrong dates. We date things we kill freshly and get wrong dates. But when a large percentage of the time, we take something we know the age of and use carbon-14 dating, radiometric dating, using carbon-14 processes, and the date does not work. Then we go and take a sample of something we do not know the age of, and guess what we do? We assume the date is correct. And in fact, we pit dates against each other, and we ultimately pick the date we like best. We'll have a host of dates, and we will settle on the date that gives the oldest date we can get away with, the oldest date that won't blow up some other piece of the supposed evolutionary story. And that's how it's really working. So some closing observations. The assumptions for carbon-14 dating are violated. Thus, the older the object, the less accurate the likelihood of that date. Or stated differently, as we move back in history, there's a greater and greater likelihood of the date being more and more erroneous. And that's because we have clear evidence in the short time that carbon-12 and carbon-14 are not the same. They're not at equilibrium in our atmosphere. And we talked about carbon-14 and how it's been increased through nuclear testing. We talked about carbon-12 and how it's currently being increased through all the fossil fuel burning. In some cases, even modern things date old. In some cases, labs return dates that are incorrect. There's one thing for sure here, and I've said it a few times, I'll say it again. The existence of carbon-14 in all of these things means they are all less than 100,000 years old at the outside maximum. Carbon-14 in coal and diamonds prove the Earth is not millions, let alone billions of years, and it doesn't matter how much in the past was produced, because it would all be gone long before we hit millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions or billions of years. So regardless of what it looked like, and we concede and cede that we don't know the levels, but regardless of what they were, it would be gone within 100,000 years. Regardless of the C4 levels then or today, God's Word provides us with the actual history of creation and has proven itself to be trustworthy. It's proven itself to be reliable. Think about the hundreds of perfectly fulfilled prophecies of the coming Messiah. That fact alone, set aside everything else, that fact alone, not only that there are hundreds of prophecies, and not only that those hundreds of prophecies have been completely and accurately fulfilled, but that all the prophecies of the coming Messiah have been completely and accurately fulfilled. The mathematical probability of that is well beyond our imagination, well beyond impossible. And that leads me to a theory that I have. And here's the theory. In the beginning, God created everything. He created the earth. He created matter. He created energy. He created light. And over the 6 days, He creates everything in our story. Everything that's part of our cosmos, part of our universe, part of our creation. And He did all of that in 6 literal 24-hour days and rested on the 7th day. And all of that happened more than 6,000 years ago, but less than 10,000 years ago. A discussion rooted in Genesis. What about the carbon-14 dates? God bless you guys. Look forward to seeing you in class. Take care.